and Carlyn Montes De Oca discuss Carlyn's new book, Junkyard Girl.
Carlyn, how are you?
I am great, David. How are you?
I'm good. And I did that because that was how you showed me to make sure I say your name right. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and do it just so I say it right, so that there's not, you don't have to hit start, start over, right? I embarrass myself or whatever because I ought to know people's names. So Carlyn, it's good to see you.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Right. Well, of course, we're great to have you. So, Carlyn, you have written. You are a very interesting person. Let me just start off by saying that you've done all kinds of things. You've been on TED Talks, a local TED Talks. You've been all over the networks on other books you've written prior. But you have a new book that is almost out. Matter of fact, it's a little confusing what state the new book is in. But it's called Junkyard Girl, a memoir of ancestry, family secrets, and second chances. Is that right?
That is correct. You got that all correct.
And when is it officially out?
All right. It's officially out November 2nd. So my launch week is November 2nd to the 9th. You do have to kind of put it up ahead of time. So there was sort of a soft launch for the advanced readers, but then everybody started finding out about it. And that's why it's kind of blowing up a little bit right now.
It's doing really good. Like I told you right before we started, if this is your soft launch, which is just getting them up there so you can actually launch. I mean, You've got 45 reviews. You're on some of the bestseller lists. I mean, this book is going to be a hit. Look, I mean, how can it not be at this point, right?
Oh gosh, I hope so. Wouldn't that be awesome?
So what is Junkyard Girl about?
Well, it is about discovering in your 50s that you're not who you thought you were. It's actually a memoir about how 3.5 years ago, I took a DNA test totally for fun. And instead of discovering I was, related to the Vikings or something else, I found out I was adopted. And
oh, wow.
Yes. And
wow.
I have a very extensive family. I have 63 first cousins. And what I discovered was most of them knew, but nobody ever told me.
Wow.
So this book is really not only the discovery of that, but when you have such a seismic shift happen in your identity where it is fractured, and because think about it, our parents, where we came from, that's the foundation of almost everything. Everything is built on that, your relationships, your career, everything. And that rug got pulled and I had to put the pieces back together again. And that's what this book is about, because I also had to go into my past and my fraught relationship with my adoptive mother, and suddenly discovering she had done something so extraordinary for me that, gosh, it just blew me away. So that's what this book is about.
Yes. It would change your perspective, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Completely.
Yeah. Now, are the parents that raised you still around?
No, they're not. They had passed, but it's almost as if from whatever realm they're in right now, they sort of helped open the doors, because the strangest synchronistic things started to happen. I mean, when I found out about the adoption, next thing I know, I have this half sister. Next thing I know, my birth mother, who everybody thought was dead, was actually in a state hospital on hospice in Chicago. So I met her 3 weeks later. It was just this continual barrage.
You met her in a hospice?
Yeah, but she didn't know who I was. I mean, she had dementia and whatnot, but it was a pretty wild ride. And that's what people keep saying. It's like a page turner. That was my life. It was a page turner. It just kept going.
Wow. That is great. Yeah. Talk about just in time. I mean, that the hospice is the end of it. And for those who don't know, that's the last stop.
And she died 6 months after I met her. So how uncanny is that out of my whole lifetime, that's when I met her, is before she died.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've had lots of my relatives end up in hospices, and no one lasted 6 months. So God bless her. Good for her. That's a really long time. Whatever was wrong with her, so good. So that's a pretty, and when did all this happen?
3.5 years ago is when I got that test.
And then, so then, like right after that, I mean, what like you got the test, and you're like, holy bananas. And
well, actually, I'll tell you quickly. Basically, I was sitting there minding my own business, writing away, and I got this message on Facebook from this guy who had friended me about a week before. And it said, "You look a lot like my wife." And I'm like, God, thinking to myself, what a flirt. And I just ignored him. But he kept persisting. And then he sent me a picture of this woman. And my husband came in and I said, do you think I look like this lady? And he's like, no. And I said to this man, look, because he kept persisting and persisting. So I said, look, I think your wife and I shop for glasses at the same store. And he said, well, Ancestry DNA says different. And I was going, whoa, how did he even know I took a test? And it ends up being that this woman and I had I hadn't read the fine line where this woman's name had popped up on my ancestry test. If I had read it, I would have seen it said, she's a potential sibling. Wow. So it started from there. That was the big, I would have ignored that test if he hadn't reached out.
That's insane. Yeah, that's creepy and interesting all at the same time. So
yeah, well, he really wanted he was like, my wife has no family and she'd really love to meet someone else who she's related to. And so it came from that space.
So I understand, but it takes in today's world, you got to work to get there, right? I mean, you can't assume that's right where it's starting. So that's interesting. Yeah. So I mean, you arguably, I mean, outside of tragedy, this is one of the biggest things that can happen to someone.
Well, I always say that people understand, especially when you get older, you understand what loss feels like. Yeah. You know, somebody you love, a parent, a sibling, you understand that. What's hard to understand is when you lose yourself, when you lose your identity. That is something I never gave one thought about. Obviously, I know people who struggle with identity, but until this happened to me in this particular way, I had no idea kind of the tumultuous, because it was a tough first year trying to kind of get my feet back on the ground. I would start crying for no reason at all. I'd be tying my shoes. I'd start crying. I'd wash the dishes. I'd start crying. And my husband would say, well, I've never seen you cry like this. And I'd say, I don't even know what I'm crying about. It was just so emotional.
Wow. Well, how do you decide through all of that? And when did you decide? You said, you're like, you know what? Not only is this the biggest thing and it's completely blown up my world, and I cry when I'm doing the dishes. I cry when I'm doing the dishes, but probably for different reasons. But how did you go from that to, I want to write this down and share this with everyone?
Well, let's say the first year was I had, except for taking notes and journaling, because for me, I make sense of the world by writing. That's how I feel I have at least some control of whatever's happening. The world is kind of chaotic and whatnot. It's like, I have to write, I have to put it down on paper. So I would do that, but I knew I was nowhere close. You have to process everything that's happened. You can't just suddenly come to some conclusions. So it took me a year and of really, because I became like an amateur sleuth. I started calling every one of those 63 first cousins and going, I have something to tell you. And they'd be like, oh, I already knew that. Oh yeah, I knew ever since I could walk. Oh, you didn't know that? And so I was calling everybody. I followed every clue I had to the very last, just because I had to put it back together in something that made sense for me. So when I felt that happen, it was about the year mark.
Okay.
And then I started to write it. And at first, I didn't know what it was going to be, but as it started, it's like a sculpture. You start seeing what's coming out of it that maybe was already there, but you're just pulling it apart. And that's when I decided, wow, let's see. And I started showing it to some beta readers who I esteemed their opinion a lot. And they were really excited about it. And then all my advanced readers were extremely excited about it. So the more I did that, the more I'm like, okay, here we go.
It's interesting that you say it took you about a year, because I've had, as you get older, you're going to have loss and all that stuff. And if it's a person like my mom, passed, my brother passed, I've had stepmoms that have passed. And it takes about a year, because I guess you have to get through the holidays and you have to get through everything once. It's the first Christmas without them. It's the first whatever without them. And then once you're through that gambit of stuff, that year amount of time seems to be when you can start to conceptualize or like look back and frame what happened, in a way that your brain can understand without the crying and stuff. So so how long did it take you to write the book?
Another year.
Okay.
So it was a year and a year. And I know some people might consider that slow. I consider that fast for me.
It's a tough
But
book.
I also wanted to write, I wanted it to be as the best thing I could because it was so personal.
Right.
And I wanted to, I just wanted to there is no perfect, of course, but I just wanted it to be the best it could be. And I feel really comfortable that, okay, that's my story. I feel good about it. So it took another year, but in that year also, it took a lot of, it's all the preparation for the book launch, which, a year ago seemed like, oh, I have plenty of time. Well, it's coming up and suddenly it's here and it's a lot of work.
Well, as we record this, it's tomorrow.
It's tomorrow.
So just to give people a feel for the date, that definitely was a lot of work. So now you published with Goose Hill Press. What is Goose Hill Press?
Well, if you dared to say my last name, Montes De Oca.
I will hear it, but I will never say it.
Okay. So what does that mean? Oca is a bird that looks like a goose. So all my friends call me Carlyn Goose Hill. So it's Montes De Oca is basically Goose Hill. Beautiful. So I'm an independent publisher. Yes.
Got it. Okay. All right. Excellent. And so what does someone get from reading Junkyard Girl?
Well, I wasn't sure what they were getting, but now that I'm reading the reviews, I'm getting that this is what I'm getting, that it just blows me away, that I have such a unique story that when I was growing up, I didn't want anybody to know the parts of me growing up because I grew up with a lot of shame and embarrassment. I had a very fraught relationship with my mother, who was first generation, who was a Mexican immigrant. I was first generation American. All I wanted to be was American, and we fought all the time. And even though I had this completely different, and also, as people will read, the title, it also brought a bit of shame. But what I started to notice is that when people were reaching out to me from completely different walks of life, completely different countries, they would say, oh my gosh, I can really relate to your story of your mother or of your growing up or of this scene that happened or of that scene. And I started just really thinking, wow, there's such a commonality in our family and our universal experience of family and relationships and life, So I think that people will take away, and I think people will take away a lot of hope and optimism. And maybe what people are telling me is that they're looking at their own families in a different light.
Interesting. So of all the feedback and everything that you got, was there any piece of it that was the most surprising or that you weren't expecting, positive or negative? Like for me, I'll just give you an example. I started writing books and all of a sudden many people in my family wouldn't read them. That was surprising for me. I just assumed they would, but anything like that? Or
well, I was actually already prepared for that because a friend of mine had written a memoir and told me none of his family would read it. Yeah. I'd also, I'm going to share somebody else's experience. I had taken a class from Isabel Allende, the author Isabel Allende, and she wrote about how her family wouldn't even talk to her after House of the Spirits until they started seeing pictures of Jeremy Irons and Meryl Streep. She would go home and see pictures of Meryl Streep, Jeremy Irons on the piano, and they were like, oh, isn't this wonderful? So I don't know. My family is pretty private. I guess I'm prepared for, they've already read the book and nobody has said a lot, but I'm okay with that because it's just what it is. Everybody has their different experience. So anything else that I'm surprised? I think I'm surprised about how people are reaching out in such a positive way. I guess the level of that is surprising me.
Interesting. Normally, I would ask you to close this off for advice that you had for someone writing a book, but I want to ask you a different question because this is a memoir book, but a lot of your other books and a lot of the work you do is with people and animals, and I'm just curious about that. I have 3 dogs and 3 cats and rescues and all that stuff. Yeah, so I was just curious, what is it that you do with the animals, and just as a way of hearing that.
Sure. Well, my focus now is, though I've done rescue and I've done all sorts of things with animals in the past, my focus is completely now on writing books and speaking. And the focus of what I have been speaking mostly about, especially with my first book called Dog as My Doctor, Cat as My Nurse, it's basically what the subtitle says, which is an animal lover's guide to living a healthier, happier, and more extraordinary life, because our companion animals do that for us in ways that people don't often realize the extent of how our animal friends can be some of the best health and wellness advocates or gurus that we can have in our life. So that's what I talk about and write about mostly.
I think that's good. That's brave. I wish I was brave enough to adopt 100 dogs, but I'm afraid of the emotional attachment. We got one guy. I got him from the pound a while ago. Now he just lost his hearing. I had another dog that lost his hearing when they get old, and it's just it's hard to watch. I mean, I'm glad I can help them, but I feel bad. So I want to adopt them all, but I can't because it's not practical.
Well, no, it isn't practical. And in my first book, I had 6 rescue animals at the time. And, it was a lot of work, but they taught me an awful lot, just about living and about life. And they had their own issues. And the best way I could always help them was to deal with my own stuff first. It's an interesting thing, that kind of mutual connection that you have with animals and how your energy affects them to be better too. So also, just so Junkyard Girl, this book also definitely has a dog theme a thread running throughout from beginning to end.
Get dog on the cover.
Dog on the cover, yeah.
All right, Carlyn. I will we'll stay in touch, and I guess, are you working on yet another book?
Well, I'm planning on taking all of December to just read and take a break, but I have about a list of about 20 books that I could potentially work on. It's just whichever one calls out the loudest, and at the end of December is the one I'll work on.
Great. Well, look, I hope you have nothing but success with Junkyard Girl, which comes out officially tomorrow, November 2nd. And I'll put links to that down below the video. And then when your next one comes out, please let me know, and we'll catch up and we'll see how you're doing.
Sounds wonderful, David. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for watching. Please consider hitting the subscribe button.